Now, today we're going to go and look at where great powers meet. We're going to Southeast Asia, which, as Professor Shambaugh tells us in his book, is fabulously diverse, both in terms of ethnicities, religions, cultural norms, but also political systems and varied experiences with the United States and China. This is an area that has had in recent years steady economic growth, home to hundreds of millions of people, collectively the sixth largest economy on the planet. Really quite remarkable, $2.6 trillion in terms of GDP. And today our speaker is Professor David Shambaugh, and he's going to be introducing his new book, Where Great Powers Meet, America and China in Southeast Asia. We will have a link to the book, to the publisher's page for the book, chat section, so you can go ahead and click on that. Now, David Shambaugh is not a new name. He is one of America's most distinguished China watchers, and he's graced us at the U.S.-China Institute with a couple of presentations on earlier books. One of his books is China as a Global Power, and another, China's Future. And he spoke about those books at USC. He's still speaking at USC, but from his home in the Washington, D.C. area. Professor Shambaugh holds the Gaston Seeger Chair in Asian Studies, Political Science, and International Affairs at George Washington University. He created and continues to lead the China Policy Program there. He's held fellowships in many different places, taught as a visiting professor in various places, and for a decade, he was the editor-in-chief of one of the leading journals in the field. He's written on a wide variety of subjects, from a reformist Prime Minister, Zhao Ziyang, China's military, what China's leaders took away from the collapse of the Soviet Union, China's America Watchers, and a lot more. Those are, when you've written 30 books, there's going to be a wide variety of topics. And in this book, he explores a remarkable amount of the history of these great powers in Southeast Asia and how Southeast Asians have coped with their attention.
I'd like to give you an overview of the book. It's hard to give an overview in 20 minutes or so of a 350-page volume, but I'll try and do that, at least enough to tease you to go down to the chat function on the bottom of the screen, which I just noticed. Maybe click on buy this book. Christmas is coming, right? Just around the corner. It makes a great gift for your loved ones or a stocking stuffer. But in all seriousness, I'm just really delighted to launch this. It just came out last week here in the United States. So let me begin. Well, let me do three things if I can. First, offer a few kind of disclaimers or explanations about what got me into this topic and this book. Then to give you our viewers, a few of the major conclusions and takeaways, and then peer into the future a little bit at the end and what possible scenarios I foresee or are possible for the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship in Southeast Asia. So that's a little roadmap of where we'll go in the next 15, 20 minutes or so. So the first thing to say is that this is has been a new experience for me, new research experience. And I had worked in my career, I've worked on Chinese foreign relations with a variety of different parts of the world, but I had never worked on Southeast Asia analytically. And honestly, I had not spent much time in Southeast Asia. I've been to Singapore a number of times and Vietnam a couple of times, and several decades ago to Burma and Thailand, but I had not really spent much time in the region. So this was both an intellectually and you might say physically new puzzle to me. And I like puzzles. In my research, I've some scholars work on the same subject, more or less throughout their careers. I, as you've noted, have kind of bounced around. That's one reason I do that is because I'm curious and I like projects that I have no idea what I'm going to find when I get into them, much less where I'm going to come out at the end. And boy, oh boy, can I tell you, Southeast Asia was very much that way, more than any other book or project I've undertaken. I had no idea of the complexity of the region. But it's been probably the most rewarding, I must say, project for me. And it stimulated a really lifelong curiosity about the region for the rest of my career. I sort of chastised myself, David, why didn't you spend more time in the region and study it earlier? But better late than never. I'm hooked on Southeast Asia as Southeast Asian studies, not just as a function of U.S.-China relations. So my last sabbatical was in 2017. And instead of going back to China, as I'd done in the previous sabbatical and others, I thought maybe do something different. And I was fortunate to get an invitation to go to the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang, Kujidasha in Singapore, an absolutely wonderful institution. I cannot say enough good things about RSIS. I commend it to everyone. They do very high quality analytical work, teaching work. I taught a couple of courses while I was there. They have great public events. Anyway, so I decided to go there. And since I was going to be in Singapore, I thought, well, maybe I can't just stay here and teach my classes and learn to understand Singapore. I needed a regional topic. So I thought, okay, let me try and educate myself about Southeast Asia, not just the international relations in Southeast Asia, but the countries themselves. And then I thought, well, maybe one vector into that subject would be what I do, which is U.S.-China relations. And I'm the previous book, as you noted, China Goes Global, I've looked at. So I thought, okay, I'll try and marry those two together. So that's the kind of background about how I circumstantially got into this. Now, the second thing to say is that this is not just a book about China and Southeast Asia, of which, interestingly and totally coincidentally, there's been a miniature tsunami recently of books, by my count, on just China and Southeast Asia in the last 6 to 8 weeks. And I think you launched at least Mike Lampton's book at the Institute. Maybe you've done Murray Hebert's new book, Sebastian Strangio and Don Emerson. All four have published in the last 2 months books on on China and Southeast Asia, which makes up for the sort of 3-decade-long hiatus since we had previous books on the region. It's a curiosity why our field has not had more books on the subject. Articles, yes. But anyway, so mine is the fifth in a short period of time, but mine is slightly different because it looks at the United States as well as China in Southeast Asia, and of course the interactions between the two and by each power with the individual member states. So that's the second contextual comment. The third caveat is that this is not just a study of contemporary affairs. I mean, it is. So if you want to learn where this subject is today in 2020 or in the last few years, yes, it's very much, this is a book for you. But I have to forewarn those of you who are going to go to maybe I shouldn't deter you from going to the chat function, but I just want you to know what you're getting in for if you order this book, namely that this is very much a book of history. And I'm not a historian. That's another caveat. I did my best to educate myself on the history of the region, but I'm very self-conscious that is not my training or my background. But once I dove into the subject matter, the contemporary subject matter, it's like pulling string. It just keeps unraveling. You cannot understand U.S. and China and Southeast Asia today in the 21st century unless you go back to the 20th. And once you start pulling the string in the 20th century, you have to go back even further. So this is a book of history. There are 2 full chapters and half of 2 others that deal with the pre-21st century presence and policies by each of the major powers with the region. Now, in the case of the United States, this goes back to 1802, when the first American consul landed in what was then known as Batavia, today Jakarta, in the Dutch East Indies, and then proceeds through the first American embassy with the Kingdom of Siam in 1833, and the first treaty the Americans signed with the Kingdom of Siam in the same year, the so-called Roberts Mission, New Hampshire merchant businessman that was sent over there. And then it moves through the rest of the 19th century, with the United States becoming an imperial, a naval, a Pacific power, and in the case of the Philippines, a colonial power. And then into the 20th century, of course, the commercial expansion, really, of the U.S. between the two world wars in Southeast Asia. Totally interesting story I had no idea about. And the Philippines colonial period, not a good story, but one that Americans need to understand a lot better. And then I moved into the Second World War, the Pacific War, both in maritime Southeast Asia and on the mainland of Southeast Asia, so-called Burma, India, China theater. And then I move in that same chapter. Historians would curse me for trying to cram so much complex history into one chapter, but that's what we political scientists are prone to do. So then I talk about the Cold War, in which, of course, is the American war in Vietnam. So that there's a big chapter on the kind of history of America's, the legacies, I call it, of America's involvement in the region. Then I do the same thing for China. Now, of course, China, it doesn't date from 1802. It dates from the Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BC. That's the first recorded records of interactions between the Han people and the peoples really south of the Yangtze, who then were known as the Yue. There were so many Yue people that the Hans called them the Bai Yue, the 100 Yues. And the Dai people, who still inhabit, as we know, Yunnan and Sichuan. So that's where the China story begins. And it, of course, then evolves through a long period of the so-called tribute system and the Nanhai South Sea trade, Nanyang trade period, about which Wang Gungwu, to whom the book is dedicated, actually, I should note, somebody I have enormous admiration for. And he has written wonderfully about China, Southeast Asian history. And then I go through all that. I also go through the difficulties, if you will, between China and Vietnam and the subjugation and occupation of Vietnam by China for a century. And I look at in the 20th, late 19th century, actually, the role that Southeast Asia played for Sun Yat-sen and the Republican revolutionaries. They hatched the revolution that seized power in China in 1911 in Malaysia, in Singapore, Penang primarily. I've been actually to the museum there. So I go through that, and then I go into the PRC period, which has kind of two elements. One is the Bandung element, the kind of non-aligned element, Zhou Enlai's trip to Bandung in 1955, and the Chinese engagement of the non-aligned movement, trying to create a third way between the two superpowers. And then in the 60s and the 70s, the Chinese became, well, there's no other word for it, subversive, really, and started exporting revolution into the region by supporting communist parties and insurgencies in every single Southeast Asian state, right? Trying to overthrow the established states. So when our friends in Beijing tell us that the People's Republic of China has never intervened in the internal affairs of other countries and always allows other states to coexist no matter what their type, well, sorry, go back and refresh one's memory about the 60s and the 70s. It's a while ago, but it's history. So I go through all that. And so those are 2.5 chapters. I just want people to know that they're going to get a dose of history if they're going to buy this book. Okay, last premise, and I'll give you a quick overview of my findings, this book proceeds from, and I believe myself, that the United States and China are now locked into indefinite, comprehensive competition across all functional domains and all regions of the world, across the planet, and indeed in space and in cyberspace and in the Arctic and the Antarctic and every region of the world. That is the defining, frankly, nature of international relations today. Great power rivalry is back, and it's U.S.-China rivalry. It's also U.S.-Russia rivalry. So Southeast Asia is not unlike any other region of the world, because these two giants, these two titans, published a previous book called Tangled Titans. These two titans are tangled everywhere on the planet, including in Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is interesting for various reasons, including history and the nation states in the region themselves, and the toolboxes, you might say, that both powers have in the region, different instruments that they are using to advance their own positions and influence in the region. So I see Southeast Asia as something of a microcosm and a harbinger of U.S.-China competition elsewhere in the world. It's in the kind of crosshairs, you might say, or it's the epicenter, is the term I use in the book, of U.S.-China competition. And like it or not, the Southeast Asian countries are having to cope with it. Frankly, I think, and I argue in the book, that they're in a somewhat serious state of denial. Some countries much more than others. Some are very alert to the competition. Others are in denial about it. Others are aware of it, but wish it would go away. So there's a kind of spectrum there. But the storm clouds of superpower or major power competition are swirling around the region over all these countries, and they're all having to cope with it in one way or another. And their way of coping is their traditional default approach to external powers. This is a region that has ample and long experience with external power intervention, imperial, colonial. This is not new territory for them, and they have learned very well over the years and after independence about hedging. Hedging is in the DNA of, you might say, diplomatic DNA of Southeast Asians. How to not get too close to anyone, maintain your autonomy, flexibility, and neutralism. So, this is something else that one learns if you aren't trained in Southeast Asian studies, just how key the kind of post-colonial neutralist identity is amongst all of the ASEAN states. Anyway, those are some preliminary contextual comments about the book. Now, what are the big takeaways? Two, I guess. First, and I won't take too much time on this, but I argue that Southeast Asia should be seen not just as a kind of petri dish or experimental area for major power contestation. Southeast Asia is really important in its own right. And Clay, in your introductory comments, you just gave us some figures and about why. Demographically, geographically, just geostrategically, the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, through which pass 55,000 ships per year, container vessels, massive things. If you ever go out there in the Straits of Malacca, as I have on sailboats and you look at these size of these vessels. Anyway, they carry 40% of the world's merchandise trade and 25% of the world's energy supplies through that very narrow isthmus down off the west coast of Malaysia, around Singapore, and up through the South China Sea. So, geoeconomically, geostrategically, very important. Economically, you're quite correct. ASEAN, 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, you add their economies together, they're the sixth largest on aggregate economy in the world, close to $3 trillion. And there are other indicators I won't elaborate. But the point is, we Americans in particular, need to educate ourselves about Southeast Asia. I, as an Asian studies scholar, am really stunned at how little Southeast Asia is taught in our universities, in our classrooms. There are some noted programs, but it needs significant more attention in its own way and in policy terms as well. So simply flag that. Secondly, I argue in the book that yes, the US and China are rivals. There's major power competition going on between them. But I use the term soft rivalry in the study to characterize the nature of the competition, soft as opposed to hard rivalry. Okay, what does he mean by that? Well, hard rivalry is the way I think of the Cold War, where the Moscow and Washington calculated their actions on the basis primarily of the other. So it really tit for tat, action, reaction maneuvering. Washington did A, Moscow countered with B, Washington would counter with C, Moscow to D, so on and so forth. So it was a very interactive, if you will, reactive, in fact, kind of superpower competition. This one in Southeast Asia between the US and China is not that way yet. May get there. And in fact, that's one of the scenarios I'll get to in a second for the future. It could become much more polarized, much more reactive, but you don't find that at present or in the last few years. Both powers are very active in the region. Both powers have multiple tools in their toolbox, if you will. And I spend a lot of time in different chapters kind of going through their toolboxes, evaluating their strengths and their weaknesses. And both powers are kind of looking over their shoulder, at the other very carefully. The Chinese are watching us really carefully. I'm not certain how carefully the Americans are watching the Chinese, but it's not an action-reaction, tit-for-tat kind of competition yet. It's like shadow boxing. May get there, but it's a different type of competition. Therefore, the Cold War metaphor does not apply in that regard to this region. And I would argue more broadly, there's lots of differences between Cold War 1.0 and Cold War 2.0, if indeed we're in 2.0. But one of those differences is the nature of the interactions in third regions between these two powers. It's different than the Soviet-American conflict. Then thirdly, takeaway, this is not just a dyadic game between these two elephants, between the US and China. They're not the only actors in the drama. There are regional middle powers that are significant in this story. Japan, India, Modi's Act East policy, but India, well, for historical reasons and others, is now very much a player, bilaterally, multilaterally, militarily, economically, many different ways in Southeast Asia. Australia, Europe, may surprise our viewers that the EU is the largest investor in Southeast Asia. And the EU, European countries individually, have a very strong, long-standing cultural presence owing to their own colonial imperial periods. There are many more Southeast Asians go to Europe for university education than they come to this country. So there are strong cultural ties, educational ties, and commercial ties. So Europe is an actor. South Korea, even. I was, in fact, in the audience in Singapore 2 years ago when President Moon came down and launched his so-called, or South Korea's southward policy. So they're in the game. Russia, even in the game. So this is not just a kind of dyadic, two big power and a number of regional countries chessboard. It's really complex. So you have 10 individual member states. Then you have ASEAN itself as an institution, at least the Secretariat is based in Jakarta. Then you have the US, China. Then you have these other middle powers. So as I say, when I got into this project, I had no idea of the complexity of it. And it makes, therefore, generalizations and conclusions really difficult. Okay, last conclusion of the book are a couple of counterintuitive findings that I didn't expect to find, but did come to find. And And namely that China is what I call an overestimated power, and the United States is an underappreciated power. Those are kind of bumper stickers, but let me explain what I mean by that. So if you travel around the region, one is struck everywhere and on a daily basis by the pervasive narrative about China, and China's rise, China's presence, China being the dominant power, how Southeast Asia is now in China's sphere of influence, and it's just a natural state of affairs, and everybody better get on the Beijing bandwagon. For reasons I don't fully understand, that narrative, which is just perpetuated across public media and social media, is a hegemonic narrative. That's all you hear. And it has, narratives have lives of their own. They're called memes right there. Whether or not they're empirically correct or not, narratives have lives of their own. And that is, so that's the predominant narrative you encounter in the region, but I find it to be overstated empirically. I find that China's presence in the region, if you go through multiple categories, and I apply like 6 categories to each power, and look through their toolbox and evaluate kind of net assessment, how strong, how weak are they in each of these 6 domains. We don't have time to go into those in the presentation. Happy to do so. They're commercial, they're diplomatic, they're military, they're cultural soft power, and technology. Oh, and what we now are calling influence operations, United Front activities. So if you look at China in those 6 categories, it's obviously very strong commercially. Its United Front influence operations, particularly amongst the diaspora, are really ramping up. But in other areas, soft power, not a lot. China doesn't have soft power anywhere on the planet, I would argue, as we had a session on that in LA a couple of years ago. And it doesn't really in Southeast Asia either. Security assistance programs, what security assistance programs? Cambodia and Myanmar is it. And Thailand, I'm sorry. The Thais are an interesting case. We can go into that if you're interested. But otherwise, the Chinese don't do much militarily with those states. And the American security assistance programs dwarf China's. So empirically, I don't think this narrative is correct. But it's there, and it's a perception, and it has its own kind of momentum. The other thing I find is that there's substantial anxiety and ambivalence and suspicion about China across the region, every single country, even in China's client state of Cambodia. And I go into that in the book, and we can talk about that if you're interested in the reasons for it, even with the BRI. Now, I have to hasten and say the BRI is generally welcomed in the region. It's generally seen as a good and needed thing. But there's also been problems with the BRI in several countries. In Malaysia, we're familiar with Mahathir's pullback from the Najib years and freezing and renegotiating BRI projects that Mike Lampton has gone into. Indonesia, they're very concerned about the 30,000 Chinese laborers in the country and the excavation of minerals up in Kalimantan and in Sumatra. They're not even really happy with the high-speed rail line between Jakarta and Bandung. It's one of those classic cases where China says, here, we'll build you a high-speed rail line. And these countries say, well, we don't. We need like water treatment plants and electricity grids and a few other things. They say, no, you need a high-speed rail line. And so the Chinese are building the high-speed rail line from Jakarta to Bandung. There are environmental problems with BRI. There are debt problems with BRI. So the BRI story has complicated itself. And it's too early to come to conclusions, but I'm just trying to flag that there have been enough problems in enough countries over BRI to add to this generalized anxiety about China in these countries. Okay. Lastly, what about the United States? So I predict that what I call Myanmar moments or Malaysia moments, as Myanmar had in 2011 after the Mitsoni Dam project was stopped by the Burmese. And the Malaysia moment is what Mahathir did by stopping the 11 BRI projects. I predict that other Southeast Asian countries are going to have similar pullback and pushback against China commercially. Now, the U.S., and I'm conscious of the time, so let me, the U.S. has its strengths and its weaknesses and its toolbox too. Diplomacy is one of our weaknesses. We are episodically present at best. Our secretaries of state will fly in maybe twice a year, give a couple reassuring speeches, fly out. Parachute diplomacy, I call it. That's a real weakness. The Southeast Asians have come to expect it, and we've got to correct it. So diplomacy, I would not put in the asset column for the United States. What I do put in the asset column, security assistance. Not Laos, not Cambodia, and not Myanmar, but the other 7 ASEAN countries, we have deep security assistance programs and military relations with. Cultural soft power, substantial, again, whether it's popular culture or it's higher education or public diplomacy. I think the U.S. has its work cut out for them to try and educate Southeast Asians about what the presence of the U.S. is in the region. Southeast Asians are really not very conscious and aware of the American presence, which brings me to commerce. I would put commerce in the asset column. The United States does $350 billion of trade in 2018 with Southeast Asia. That's not up there with China, which is now almost $600 billion. In fact, this year, the first quarter of this year, ASEAN has become China's leading trading partner, overtaking the EU. We'll see if that stays. So, in total terms, American trade, Chinese trade, they do far more. Flip that around when it comes to investment. The United States, on an annual basis, invests twice as much as China, $25.9 billion. China, $12.9 billion in 2018, which is the last years we have figures. So just the annual FDI flow in 2018, the US twice as much. But then if you look at the cumulative stock, this is my favorite statistic, the US accumulated stock is $329 billion. China's is about 170 now. America's cumulative stock is greater than China, Japan, and South Korea combined. How many Southeast Asians know that? Not many, not any I came across. So America's commercial footprint, very deep. We have 4,200 companies operating in the region. AmCham's very active. So the U.S., I call an underappreciated power. We have a lot of intrinsic strengths and a lot of presence and a good foundation on which to build. Okay, let me just conclude. See the clock moving. What about the future? So I posit at the end of the book 4 scenarios. It's a spectrum of where I see Southeast Asian countries today. This is very much a kind of 2020 snapshot. Net assessment, where they fall along a continuum between the US and China. And you can see that 7 of the 10 are on the PRC side of the so-called neutral line, 3 of the 10, Vietnam, Singapore, the Philippines on the American side. But even the 3 that are on the American side are much closer to the neutral line, right? That's not an accident. This slide was put together not just to position countries vis-a-vis each other, but actually where they are, they're all leaning towards China. So this is a finding. It substantiates the narrative I was describing, but I have to tell viewers this is very fluid. It's not static, and it can change. A year or 2 years ago, when I was in the midst of this research, it wasn't exactly this way, and I can envision the Philippines moving much closer to the U.S. after Duterte leaves the scene, for example. I could see Cambodia, which right now is way down there. It's the client state of China. It's like the 31st province of the PRC. Well, Hun Sen leaves the scene. Cambodia will exert greater agency, I would argue. Myanmar has slipped back since 2011, and its move away from China has kind of fallen back into the sway of Chinese influence. Malaysia is very fluid. Indonesia, fluid. So anyway, that's a sort of snapshot. The point is, though, that bandwagoning, first scenario, continued bandwagoning with Beijing can continue. Okay, second scenario, would be that there's a greater polarization and sort of hard rivalry, as I describe it, which will stress all 10 of those countries. That's the nightmare of all Southeast Asians. Don't make us choose, they keep telling us. Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in particular is very articulate about this, but they know none of them want to be forced into a false choice. And if the United States is smart in its diplomacy, it will not try and force such a choice. Beijing, frankly, I think is, amongst other things, not so smart in its diplomacy. And I argue in the book, and one of my big takeaways is that China is already overreaching, overstepping, alienating many countries in the region, and that is a secular trend. And I don't see any indications really of it changing. I don't see any indications that China's even aware of that anxiety and suspicion that one encounters across the region. China's just sort of on autopilot. And they live in a kind of propaganda bubble, I would argue, and they don't listen. And they don't really hear on the ground, civil society, how they are viewed. That's why Myanmar did what it did. That's why Malaysia did what it did. And I would anticipate we're going to have more Myanmars and Malaysias in Indonesia and in Cambodia in particular, and even in the Philippines. So that's where I wind up in the book. The fourth scenario is a kind of more neutral hedging, which would be a movement away from the bandwagon, back towards the middle of the spectrum. No bandwagoning with America. Those days are over. So I would anticipate, just to conclude then, that's really, I think, the future. China is its own worst enemy in the region. And from an American standpoint, it's perhaps the greatest asset for the United States in the region, is China's overreach and capacity for that. So for the United States, the new Biden administration, we just have to stay steady, be present, invest in our tools of power, and provide Southeast Asian countries an option to China. Don't force them to choose. That's a false choice, but just be there and present the option. Because I think that as Beijing becomes too omnipresent, too overbearing, too proximate, too manipulative, and too interventionist, not to mention the South China Sea, that these countries are going to move away from China. And the U.S. should be positioned at that point to be supportive. So I'll end there. But the U.S. has got to kind of keep its cool and get in the game.
You've already anticipated the first of the questions that I wanted to put forward to you, but let me ask it anyway. You earlier wrote about China as a limited global power, that it had aspirations but had not yet arrived, and wrote about that. And a significant part of that was the soft power question. Mm-hmm. But in this book, a couple years later, that's still the case, closer to home. And I think your big point about the U.S. being an underappreciated power and China, the assumption is that it's bigger, more influential, more present than you, in fact, found it to be. And so I have this question, and is it just a matter of time? Is it just a matter of time? Or is proximity a key source of fear, as well as the experience that you highlighted in the book and in your talk of Beijing fomenting rebellions against governments in the region? And that may not be clear in the minds of many people in Southeast Asia. It's also a young demographically region, but certainly it's in the minds of leaders. Tell us why. Why has the reach? Now, you've already explained something about overreach, but take it apart a little bit more.
Well, happy to do so. And I'm glad you mentioned again the subversion of the 60s and the 70s. Yes, that was 40, 50 years ago. But the Southeast Asians have long memories. They also have much longer than that, to the tribute system and to the Ming and to Zhenghe and to the Nanyang trade. So that's just embedded in the historical memories of Southeast Asians when they think about China. And the overseas Chinese dimension of that, which we haven't talked about, is a sensitivity, fair to say. It's also a open wound in many of these societies, Malaysia and Indonesia in particular. And that's why China's ramped up increased United Front activities targeting the overseas Chinese diaspora in these countries is so alarming to Southeast Asians in recent years. I mean, there have been riots just here in the last few years in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. I was driven in Jakarta last year past a neighborhood that was just charred, literally, had been burned out. These are all Chinese shops. And the Jakarta municipal government had not destroyed the burned out shops and rebuilt it. One can speculate about why they left them like that. As an example, I don't know. I don't want to speculate about that. But the point is that the overseas Chinese, the view of them as a so-called fifth column is still fresh. And among Southeast Asians who see China as manipulating the Huaqiao in the region. So, and China's not aware of that. That's another part of China's tin ear, I call it. China just doesn't have an ear on the ground. And I went through, mind you, in part of the research, lots of writings on Southeast Asia in China. And I went to the leading Southeast Asia institution in China, Xiamen University. Wonderful place, Xiamen, great university, long tradition, great faculty, really interesting students. But if you look at Southeast Asian studies in China, this is a kind of a tangent, you don't find much. You find it in Xiamen, you find it in Guangxi, and in Kunming. Okay, you don't find it in Beijing. There isn't a single Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, for example, in the Academy of Social Sciences. You don't find Southeast Asia specialists at Kicker and CIS and these other institutes. So it's a kind of curiosity. The Chinese are not paying attention to Southeast Asia. And when they do, they pay attention only to governments and elites. And that's a recipe for mistakes. If you don't have your ear to the ground at societies, civil societies, you're going to get bitten. And that's what happened to China in Myanmar in 2011. So sorry, I went off on that tangent. Sorry, your original question.
The question is, again, why, with all of the investment and energy and all of this,
right,
why has the impact been limited?
So it's funny. China's strength is also its weakness. I would ask many Southeast Asians, different countries, what is China's greatest strength here? Proximity and money. It kept coming back. Money, proximity. And when they talk about China, they would always point to the sky. China's right up there, right? Because if you're Southeast Asia, it's up there. It's so close. And then they are flooding the region with money. Now that's just a reality, but I think it's also a weakness. So there is a sort of virtue with distance, but that cuts both ways too. That's the American problem in diplomacy, the tyranny of distance. It's a long way out there from Washington, D.C., where I'm sitting, to the region. It's a 22-hour flight. It's not like 13 to Beijing or Tokyo. So I think proximity, it's a reality. You can't change geography, but it's not helping China because China's just too present and doesn't know how to back off, and let distance is a good thing in relationships sometimes. China's just, too proactive in the commercial space. It's not very active in these other spaces, I was surprised to find. So.
It's striking in the book. I think there's 3 pages with this list of different China ASEAN relationship building enterprises. And yet your point is that there's not enough listening on Beijing's side.
It's classic Chinese diplomacy. Let's designate our relationship a strategic partnership, and then let's sign a gazillion MOUs. So there is this list of, I put it in there simply for illustration's sake of all these MOUs and different weeks, this month, that week, this project, that project. But if you go to that China has signed with ASEAN, if you even go to the secretariat in Jakarta and interview them, as I did do, about these events that they have signed up to, most of them are, the diplomats I talk to sort of scratch their head and say, what? No, oh yeah, we signed that 4 years ago. It's never happened. We've never met. It's sort of on paper. And then if you actually go to the capitals in the 10 countries and you say, how does this list apply to you, here in Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok? I say, what list? So it's the Chinese way. It helped to create that misperception of Chinese tsunami. But in fact, there's not much there on these kinds of diplomatic interactions. It's kind of surprising, so one shouldn't judge diplomatic relationships based on partnerships and agreements and MOUs, that was another thing I learned.
Well, and that gets at part of it is having the signing ceremony doesn't yield anything beyond a photo opportunity, right? So you're talking about that. But you also highlighted that despite this incredible amount of current trade between the United States and Southeast Asia, but also, of course, between Southeast Asia and China, but also the investment stock, the pool of things already built, already functioning, that many people, certainly in the United States, but also, as you highlighted, in Southeast Asia, they still underestimate the level of economic engagement. Mm-hmm. To what do you attribute that?
By the United States, the American economic engagement?
On either side, on why Americans don't appreciate Southeast Asia as fully as they might, and why Southeast Asians may overestimate China's economic impact.
Well, part of it has to do with the types of commercial activity, I think. And another surprising thing I stumbled across and found is that China builds things in the region. America facilitates them. If there's a list of the companies, I mentioned there are 4,200 companies, that the U.S. has in Southeast Asia. Well, those are not companies that are in the infrastructure business or in the building business. China is building a lot of hard fixed assets. Okay, well, the U.S. it's like in healthcare, in consulting services and legal services, Airbnb. I don't have the list in front of me, but Caterpillar has been there for a long time. Bechtel was there, left, and now has gone back in. But that's not the kind of American companies that you find operating. So the American companies are sort of operating in this sort of in-between space where they can't be seen. Whereas you see physically Chinese projects that have big character signs hanging on them as they're being built. I went to a number of these BRI projects, by the way, in Malaysia and Indonesia in particular, and Vietnam. So I think that's part of the answer. And I interviewed one very senior Singaporean diplomat, and I said, well, why is America so underappreciated? Why don't Southeast Asians know about this reservoir of involvement in the region? He said, David, you're taken for granted, you Americans. You've been here a long time. We know what you bring and what you do. And we hope and expect you to continue to do it. China, he said, is the new game in town, the new kid on the block. Even though there are centuries of interactions, the story of China is very much a 21st century story. You have to go back, which I've done recently for the next book I'm writing, in fact. Looking at I'm writing the next book on Chinese leaders, from Mao to now, just to flag that. I have to come back next year when that comes out at the launch. But I've been looking at the Jiang Zemin and the Hu Jintao diplomacy. Not much at all in Southeast Asia. Hu Jintao paid more attention to the global South, Africa, Latin America. And Jiang Zemin launched FOCAC with Africa. But Southeast Asia has not been much of a focus for Beijing, really, I would argue, to the last decade. That substantiates this diplomat's point. It says, you Americans have been here since your Vietnam War, even longer. The Chinese have had their history, but this is rather new. So I don't know if that answers the question. It's a puzzle. It's one of those puzzles I didn't satisfy fully about why the U.S. is so underappreciated. And I think, lastly, part of it has to do with the American government. It doesn't tell its own story well. Public diplomacy, as I say, is a big challenge. We need to do much better. I don't mean to denigrate our public diplomacy officers in U.S. embassies of who I met all over the region. I was on the State Department speakers program, by the way, throughout this research. I gave like 40 lectures in 10 countries in 6 months. And I was handled by the PD sections. Wonderful Foreign Service officers, very dedicated, hardworking individuals, but there's no strategy. They would wait for instructions from Washington, and instructions from Washington would really never come. And so they were kind of on their own. So I think we've really got to ramp up our PD game, we call it in DC, the public diplomacy game, and tell our own story. Now, last point is we've not got a great story to tell in the last few years. That has also really damaged our reputation. At the end of the Obama administration, the American reputation in Southeast Asia was the highest ever by some margin. The Obama administration and Obama himself, having lived 6 years of his childhood in Indonesia, they invested big time in Southeast Asia, and this was unusual. Under Trump, first of all, the diplomacy reverted to the mean of episodic parachute diplomacy. I think Pompeo has been to Southeast Asia twice in his 4 years as Secretary of State. And then I was going to say the dysfunctionality of our democracy at home, our systemic racism, the social inequalities, our handling of COVID or mishandling of COVID, all these things have really damaged America's reputation in the region, indeed worldwide. But if you look at the annual survey of the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, it comes out every January. It will be out in a few weeks. There are some really interesting findings there. And those surveys show public opinion suspiciousness of China, too, as well as disappointment with America. So, we've got our work to do, but we have to tell our own story better.
Well, and thank you for that assessment. And in the book, you draw on some of these opinion surveys and offer some illustrations. I really appreciated, the history. And it was really striking to me. I think part of the reason you were telling it is that you had done this work to understand it. And I thought that it was really important, and you've already highlighted this in the discussion, Southeast Asians know this history. And so they are judging Chinese and Americans with that historical background. And as you've highlighted, neither the Chinese nor the Americans possess that same level of knowledge. And so that leads to missteps and miscommunication and failures to connect where it might be possible. Now, David, we've got a bunch of questions in only a few minutes, but I wanted to try and group a few of them together. And several of the questions ask very specifically about this country or that. And others ask about topics that you don't really address in this book, which is centered on Southeast Asia. But you did highlight this comprehensive competition that exists between the United States and China, and you've identified it in your talk and in the book as the defining international affairs reality of the 21st century. Could you, and again, this is based on deep research on Southeast Asia and less research on other regions, but some of our viewers have asked, is China doing better or worse in Southeast Asia compared to South Asia, compared to Africa, compared to Central Asia?
Okay, great question. I think the soft rivalry, first of all, is a good thing. We don't necessarily want it to become a hard polarized, action, reaction, Cold War style rivalry. And that benefits Southeast Asians too. So that's a kind of feature that Southeast Asians would like to continue and maintain. But I think both powers, maybe this just comes with being a major power. Major powers have certain features: a sense of exceptionalism, a sense of being self-convinced in their own importance in the world and their models for the world, and they are on autopilot, I argue in the book. The Chinese are on autopilot, so if you're going to be an effective power anywhere, it goes back to the China Goes Global book too, I argued. And you were correct a minute ago to say in China Goes Global, I called it a partial power, by which I said it depends on the category you're looking at, some stronger than others. And here I am 6 years later in Southeast Asia, and I'm still finding China a partial power. Strong in some categories, not in others. It's a very mixed bag. But with regard to China in Southeast Asia, they don't listen well, and that's going to be their, I don't know if it's their undoing, but it's going to undermine their position and strategy. If you're going to be effective in anywhere in the world, if you're a big power, you got to listen. And you have to take criticism. It just comes with being a power. China's not exactly known for taking criticism or taking it constructively. It's not, something we associate with Chinese diplomats and wolf warriors, and others. America, we've been a power for much longer. We've taken criticism for, well over half a century. We don't do it well either, but we've had experience with it. And we are a democracy, I would argue, too. So we're a system in which criticism is embedded and inbuilt in our civil society and our democratic systems. It's not a problem, it's a strength. Well, China has no criticism is about diolian, loss of face, right? And there's certainly not a democracy. So I'm just trying to say that the U.S. is actually better positioned to understand the sensitivities in Southeast Asia than is China. And if China wants to improve, it needs to kind of tune up its listening skills. Now, the question from the audience about these other regions, Africa has been the one region of the world where China's had the longest presence, goes back to 1964 and Zhou Enlai's visit there, and then subsequent presence, pretty much continually. During the Deng period, less so. And if you look at public opinion polls, Pew and others, China's reputation across the world is highest in Africa. However, if you look at the last 4 years, you see a drop of 10, 12 points across the African countries. And if you look at the most recent Pew polls, which survey, I think, 25 countries, China's reputation is just plummeting. It's at the worst state it has ever been. Most of those countries are OECD countries, okay? But occasionally you get data from the global south. And what one finds is what I found in Southeast Asia. In other words, China's activities in other regions, and we see it in Europe, both pre and post-COVID. I spent a lot of my career doing transatlantic work in Europe. So China's, Edward Luckbach calls it big power autism. It's not my term, it's his term. Well, China's got a big power autism problem that it needs to kind of figure out, or it's just going to continue to injure itself by stepping on others and kind of steamrolling others. So I found that in Southeast Asia. I think we're beginning to see it. We certainly in Europe, Canada, Australia. South Asia, complicated. We could take a lot of time, have another session on that. China's really beavering away throughout the Indian Ocean littoral, BRI and other ways. Central Asia, I would say the Central Asian states are quite close to China, but I was in Kazakhstan just before COVID broke out, and I can tell you there's ambivalence in Kazakhstan about the Chinese too. There's ambivalence everywhere. That is the defining global feeling about China. So, I think that hopefully that addresses your viewer's question. It varies by region, but I think you find across regions this general secular trend.
Yeah, and you highlight in the book pervasive ambivalence.
Right.
It's kind of a defining response. And of course, China is not the only big power to suffer bouts of autism. We've had plenty of that here. A couple other questions that have come up, and we only have time for a couple. One involves what you were just talking about with regard to the South China Sea. And how that has played out, because you highlighted, of course, the Straits of Malacca, 1.5 mile wide, and thousands upon thousands of container ships, and the dependency of much of Asia on oil from other places to pass through there, and
right.
and goods to get out. This sort of thing. Can you discuss how the island building, the militarization of some of those facilities, how that has played out with those folks who are most directly connected to it?
Sure. A very, very appropriate question. First, all those container vessels, they go down around Singapore, then they make a U-turn and go north up through the South China Sea to Japan, to South Korea, to China itself, to Taiwan. Hu Jintao once referred to this as China's Malacca dilemma. Yeah. And they've started to build as many pipelines as they can to get their energy not by sea, but over land. But the question about how is the island building viewed in the region, well, it's another example of this hand-wringing that you encounter in the region, the anxiety, the angst about China's activities time after time. In this case, it's the island grabbing, it's the 9-dash line, it's the ignoring of the Hague resolution ruling, and it's the militarization. Southeast and 6, if you count Indonesia's disputes over the Natunas, 6 ASEAN members contest islands in the Paracels and the Spratlys in the South China Sea. So this is very real. Geographic contestation. Of course, China refuses to negotiate a package deal, will only deal individually with the member states. So it's a serious problem for those 6 states, but there's a sense I encountered of kind of resignation. I don't know how else to put it in the region. Hand-wringing, but resignation. They said, well, yeah, no, we don't like it. Those are our islands, and those are our reefs, and these are going to be Chinese military bases. We don't like it, but what can we do about it? So, unfortunately, there's a kind of fait accompli sense in the region. The South China Sea, I have to say, seems to be talked about more and matter more here in Washington, D.C., where I live, than it does out there, curiously. It's not the top subject of discussion when you talk to people about China. There's a lot of anxiety about it. And it's another example. If China were smart, it would just, follow international law and split the difference between contested spaces and do joint exploration. This is such a diplomatic winner potentially for China, but oh no, that's not where China goes. And therefore it's damaging itself very profoundly in the eyes of Southeast Asians.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting assessment that folks in DC within the Beltway may be more preoccupied with it than people who are, in those transit zones, the people adjacent to.
Yeah, it was surprising. I would go from capital to capital and talk to officials in Vietnam. Yeah, it's a big deal in Hanoi. And I did have discussions in Manila about it. And I talk in Jakarta. I mean, yes, it's discussed, but it's not a first order, front burner, preoccupying concern of these countries. They sort of feel they don't like it, but what are they going to do about it? That's where the Americans come in. They want the Americans to be there running their FONOP operations and, counterbalancing and keeping the sea lanes open. Those are crucial sea lanes.
And that's seen as a positive role and a necessary role that only the United States, perhaps in concert with other partners,
yep.
and carry out. Now, one of the things that sparked in part by your spectrum slide that you showed, and also your discussion, because you mostly didn't talk about these political systems of these various places. And that's one of the striking things, is that you have very different political structures in these countries, but that doesn't necessarily predict where they wind up, at least at this moment, on that spectrum. And we've got questions about Thailand, questions about Vietnam, and this sort of thing. But ideology and political structure, doesn't seem to be the answer to some of these questions. We see, and authoritarian countries may or may not be attracted by another authoritarian.
Good observation. The country that has the worst relations with communist China is communist Vietnam, two Leninist states. But interestingly, here's another counterintuitive finding I found. The Sino-Vietnamese relationship is not as antagonistic as Americans here, again, inside the Beltway, think it is. Here, if you go around Washington, D.C., Vietnam is considered kind of a de facto ally of the U.S. Well, I'm sorry, that's a hope, maybe a misplaced hope by Americans. Yes, the Vietnamese look to the U.S. They want to build a relationship with us, but they're also slow walking the defense relationship. I interviewed, and it's in the book, our defense attachés in Hanoi, and I went to some length to describe how the Vietnamese are putting up barriers to U.S.-Vietnamese defense cooperation. One ship visit a year, for example. Only certain exercises. They don't really want to go into arms sales. They don't want to do joint training. They don't want logistics facilities in their territory, as the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia all facilitate, and Singapore all facilitate. So the Vietnamese-China relationship, party-to-party relations, trade relations, investment relations, government-to-government relations are all really deep. Brantley Womack, our colleague in University of Virginia's got a wonderful book on this, and it's much deeper than Americans understand. And the American relationship is not as deep, at least as those Americans here inside the Beltway like to think. But it's very much, all these countries are different. That's the first lesson you learn when you go out there, diversity. Second lesson you learn, ASEAN does not represent Southeast Asia. You have to go to each country. And the Thai case is to me, it's the swing state in the region. If China is going to dominate Southeast Asia, Thailand is the key indicator, not the Philippines. Duterte will be gone in 2 years, and I will predict the Philippines are going to swing back very close to the traditional position of the United States. The armed forces of the Philippines, Philippine civil society, everybody, they don't want a new big relationship with Beijing, as Duterte does. So that's a very leader-driven situation. And then you have to kind of go through country by country. Now, the Indonesians, I've never been anywhere as more insular, Clay, than Indonesia. It is, it's the so-called natural leader of ASEAN, right? Almost 300 million people, and 4,000 islands, and biggest country. But talk about insular and self-preoccupied, domestically preoccupied. Indonesia doesn't understand the big power storm clouds that are circulating over them. So you really have to go. I mean, we could have another hour, and you have to go country by country. But maybe if you buy the book, I do that in the book. You can kind of go through the book. And Murray Hebert's, I must say, just to plug Murray's book and Sebastian Strangio's book and Don Emerson's book, they also go country by country, and Mike Lampton's book, because the answer to this question is very country dependent. So
now, I wish we had another hour, and we'll definitely have you back from Mao to Now, whatever the title ends up being for that book. But David, this is a terrific book. I heartily encourage people to get it. It is rich for those of us who are interested in the US-China relationship and how it plays out in this particular region. But the real treasure here is seeing Southeast Asia up close and understanding the importance of history and the importance of of these countries' relations, not just with the two big powers, but with Australia, with Japan, and with each other. That dynamic comes through very much in this book. And so thank you for writing it, and thank you for sharing with us today. If you have any final comments, we'd like to give you a chance.
Well, I just say complexity, what you just said, and what I found in only 4 years or 3 years really of research and writing, everything about Southeast Asia boils down to diversity and complexity. And any external power who doesn't understand the diversity and complexity and burrow into the minutia of these, not just countries and states, but cultures and ethnicities, you're not going to succeed if you're an external power. Unfortunately, the devil is really in the detail when it comes to Southeast Asia. And it makes for extraordinary complexity, and one size doesn't fit all. But if the U.S. is going to be effective in the new Biden administration or any subsequent administration, it's got to kind of get fingernails dirty and get down, understand the minutia of these 10, actually 11 countries. Timor-Leste is not a member of ASEAN, because that'll behoove us in the long run. And Beijing, if it's going to be effective, has got to do the same thing. I have my doubts about whether Beijing is capable of doing that. I would hope that the Americans are capable of doing that, but we'll have to wait and see how this plays out.
Thank you. And definitely complexity is the reality, but I want to encourage viewers to get the book, because what you'll find is clarity. This complex situation, as with all of David's books, is made clear. Very much evidence-driven and interview-driven, deeply researched, and recommended for all, as are those other books that David put in a plug for a few minutes ago. I need to, first of all, ask wherever you are watching this, that you join us in thanking David. We hope to have him out in Los Angeles sometime. Sooner is better than later. But in any case, we look forward to having you back. And I want to thank everybody who's been a part of this today. Some of you've submitted questions. Others hopefully will share the video link once this video is posted in the next day or two with friends and colleagues, so that they can get an introduction to this place where great powers meet. Friends, thank you all for being with us today.